Probably the most important topic in memory, or in chapter 6, is about the types or stages of memory. And this is important not only because you need it for the test of this assignment or of this material, but also because it's just part of our everyday lives. And there's a lot of misinformation about this in the media. People kind of get this all wrong. So you want to familiarize yourself with the 3 types or stages of memory. So the first one is sensory memory. And information, I'll tell you more about that in just a second, but information we pay attention to in sensory memory gets passed to short-term or working memory, and information we pay attention to in our short-term or working memory gets passed on to long-term memory, where it might stay forever. So let's talk about each of these a little bit. Sensory memory holds all of the information our senses receive for a very brief period of time until the brain can begin to process it. So in the virtual lecture, I gave you the little chart that includes the duration, capacity, and function for each type or stage of memory. So you want to pay attention to that information. Sensory memory has an unlimited capacity. It literally holds all of the information our senses pick up, but it holds it for a very brief period of time. So an example of sensory memory is, while I speak, I cause the air to move in waves, and those puffs of air hit your eardrum, eventually causing cells in the inner ear to fire, and when they fire, they send a message to the brain about the pattern of puffs of air that's been received. Well, your sensory memory holds that pattern of puffs of air long enough for the brain to start to make sense of it. And you've experienced this if someone says something to you and you say, "What?" And by the time you finish saying, "What?" then you remember what they say. You literally play it back for yourself because it's still held in that sensory memory. But our acoustic sensory memories, or memories for sound, only last 3 to 4 seconds in sensory or working memory, unless we pay attention to that information and pass it into working or short-term memory. Similarly, for the eyes, we have iconic sensory memory, or memory for visual information, and it's actually memory for all of the beams of light that are hitting your retina at any given time. And in fact, you use it to fill in the blanks in what you're looking at. Your eyes don't see the smooth, connected picture of the world of which you are aware, but instead move in tiny jumps from one focus to the next. But you don't see those tiny jumps. You don't see one focus and then the next. You see a smooth, connected picture of the world. Sometimes certain people's saccadic eye movements, they're called, are more noticeable than others. You can literally see their eyes moving from one little jump to the next, but you're not aware of that. You see the smooth, connected picture of the world. Similarly, you have a blind spot in the back of your eye where the optic nerve leaves the eye, and in that blind spot there are no sensory receptors. There's no retinal cells, no rods and cones. So, and you do have a spot of very concentrated rods and cones right next to that optic nerve that helps with this job. That's called the fovea. But you have that blind spot where you don't have any visual receptors, but you're not aware of that blind spot because your mind is constantly using your sensory memory to fill in the blank. And it only lasts less than a second. So, but again, it holds everything the senses pick up for that period of time. And only information that you pay attention to gets passed into the next level, which is working or short-term memory. So we also have this for touch, and that lasts about a second. So, and information in sensory memory is held in this sensory register, they call it. So, and some people, really kids, this phenomenon is rarely, if ever, seen except in children, but can have an eidetic sensory memory, where they really seem to have to take a picture of what they've seen. It's as if their sensory register processes right into their working memory, and they're able to remember absolutely everything they've seen. The next type of memory is short-term or working memory, and the Magic 7. And looking at the chart from the virtual lecture, you'll see that the function of this memory is twofold. It's also called working memory. So we call it short-term memory because it includes that temporary storage of information for 30 seconds or less. That's the duration. And it only holds about 7 items. So you want to think of this type of memory as your conscious operating space. What you're conscious of right now, it's as if it's this piece right here in front of your eyes, and it is very small. We tend to overestimate what we can do with that conscious operating space. We tend to think that we can drive and text at the same time, or even talk on the phone and drive effectively. And you'll remember from chapter 4 that we're really terrible at that. Whatever has our attention tends to have our undivided attention. So because the capacity of that conscious operating space, it's kind of like the memory on a computer, the programs a computer can be running at any given time, the work it can actively do in that space. Your space is really small. If it was a computer, it'd be a really bad computer. You just can't do very much in that space because it only holds 7 items. So in the memory experiments with short-term or working memory, I can read you 10 numbers and you might be able to write them down, but a minute later you're not going to remember all of them, more than likely. And that's your short-term or working memory. People will say, I don't remember what I did yesterday because my short-term memory is bad, or I don't remember what I did an hour ago, my short-term memory is bad. That's not your short-term memory. Anything longer than 1 minute, anything longer than 30 seconds, more correctly, has been passed into working memory. Otherwise it would have faded, or I'm sorry, has been passed into long-term memory. Otherwise it would have faded from your working or short-term memory. So let me say that again. Anything longer than 30 seconds has been passed into your working or long-term memory. So your short-term memory is failing. That can be a very serious problem, where you wouldn't be able to remember the beginning of a sentence someone is saying to you long enough to understand the end of it. You wouldn't be able to carry on a conversation. You wouldn't be able to read the problem in a multiple choice test and remember it long enough to consider the answers. All of those things are tasks of your working or short-term memory. So then the last type of memory is the easiest to remember, and that is long-term memory. Long-term memory, the function is simply storage of an unlimited amount of information for an unlimited period of time. So the duration and capacity are both unlimited. So you see how, this is the Atkinson and Shiffrin model, that's who suggested this. You see how it works. You have information that comes into your eyes and ears and other senses, and is held in that sensory memory for less than 3 or 4 seconds. 3 or 4 seconds or less for auditory information, less than a second for visual information. Information you pay attention to in sensory memory gets passed into that working or short-term memory, so you become consciously aware of. It's what you're thinking about right now. You can also get information into your short-term or working memory by pulling it out of long-term memory. So if I ask you what you had for breakfast this morning, you just pulled that out of long-term memory into your working memory. So now you're consciously thinking about something that was in your long-term memory. So now it's in your short-term memory. And then information you pay attention to in short-term memory gets passed into long-term memory, where it might just stay forever. So those are the 3 types or stages of memory and the function, duration, and capacity of each.